The War Council chamber of the Yelleth flagship buzzed with an undercurrent of triumph. Towering figures with scaled skin and sharp mandibles surrounded the circular table, their eyes fixed on the central hologram of Earth. The humans had dared to resist. How quaint! General Skor leaned forward, his dark carapace gleaming under the pale blue lights. His claws tapped a calculated rhythm on the table. The humans have been offered two choices: surrender or annihilation. Their response will reveal if they are fools or cowards. The hologram flickered, replaced by the face of Earth's ambassador. A frail, unimpressive figure compared to the warriors gathered. Yet his voice carried an edge, something almost defiant. Humanity rejects your ultimatum. Skor's mandibles spread in amusement. So, fools it is. The ambassador's face hardened. We are sending our champion to answer your challenge. Murmurs rippled through the room. Skor's claws stopped tapping. A champion? Against the might of the Yelleth Empire? His voice dripped with disdain. What is this, champion? The ambassador didn't flinch. A soldier. His name is Captain John Mason. The hologram cut off before Skor could respond. For a moment, silence blanketed the chamber. Then laughter erupted, a chorus of hissing and clicking that reverberated off the polished walls. A single soldier? One of the counselors spat. An insult! Or desperation? Another countered, his tone dripping with scorn. Skor raised a hand, silencing them. His mandibles clicked thoughtfully. Desperation breeds recklessness. Recklessness is dangerous. He leaned back, his voice turning cold. Bring this champion to me. The Yelleth docking bay was cavernous, its metal walls lined with towering mechs and gleaming starships. Mason stepped out of the human shuttle, his boots echoing against the deck. His presence seemed to shrink the massive space around him. The lone figure, clad in battered combat armor, looked up at the gathering of alien soldiers with an expression that was almost bored. A hulking guard shoved a clawed finger toward Mason. Move, human! Mason tilted his head, scanning the room with deliberate slowness. Nice welcome committee, he muttered, just loud enough to be heard. He was escorted down a long corridor, the guards flanking him on either side. Mason didn't fidget or glance around nervously. Instead, he walked with a steady, deliberate pace, his eyes locked straight ahead. The subtle smirk on his face only seemed to enrage his escorts. The chamber doors slid open, revealing General Skor seated at the head of the council. His piercing gaze locked onto Mason. So, this is humanity's champion. Mason stopped a few paces short of the table, arms loose at his sides. Captain John Mason, he said, his tone casual. Nice to meet you, General. Skor, is it? Big fan of your war crimes. The room hissed with outrage. One counselor slammed a fist onto the table, but Skor raised a hand to silence them. His mandibles clicked as he studied the human. You are either very brave or very foolish, Skor said. Do you know what awaits you here? Yeah, Mason replied, his smirk widening. You're about to lose. The laughter that followed was sharp and derisive. Mason let it roll over him, unfazed. He took a step closer, his gaze never leaving Skor. You think numbers win wars? Big fleets, big armies, overwhelming firepower. But let me tell you something about humans. We don't win because we outnumber our enemies. We win because we outthink them. Skor's amusement flickered, replaced by a faint undercurrent of unease. He leaned forward. Bold words for a creature so insignificant. Mason shrugged. We'll see how insignificant I am when this is over. Hours later, Mason sat in a stark cell deep within the flagship. He examined the single metal bench, the glowing energy barrier sealing him in, and the small monitoring drone hovering in the corner. It was a basic setup, almost insultingly so. The Yelleth clearly didn't consider him a threat. Amateurs, he muttered, reaching into a hidden compartment in his armor. He pulled out a tiny device, barely the size of a coin, and tapped it twice. The drone sputtered and fell to the floor with a faint clink. Step 1, Mason said to himself, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He moved to the barrier, studying its oscillating light. From another compartment, he retrieved a slender metallic strip. In seconds, he had the barrier flickering, then gone. Mason stepped into the corridor, his movements quick but silent. His smirk had hardened into a focused determination. The corridors were a maze of identical steel walls, but Mason had memorized the ship's layout during his transport. He navigated with precision, planting small devices in key locations as he moved, an air filtration unit here, a power relay there. Each device blinked once before going dark, waiting for a remote signal. The flagship's engineering bay loomed ahead, its massive reactor core humming with energy. Mason slipped inside, unnoticed among the bustling Yelleth workers. He crouched behind a console, attaching a final device directly to the core's control panel. The small screen blinked red then green. A distant explosion rocked the ship. Alarms blared, and the bay erupted into chaos. Mason slipped back into the shadows, a ghost among the scrambling engineers. His comm device buzzed in his ear, a familiar voice crackling through. "Captain, status? Phase 1 complete," Mason whispered. "Time to light the fuse." On the command deck, Skor's mandibles twitched in irritation as reports flooded in. Explosions in the engineering bay. Communication relays failing. Power fluctuations across the ship. "How is this possible?" one officer barked. "We've scanned him thoroughly. He had no weapons." Skor's claws raked across the armrest of his chair. "Weapons are not his threat," he growled. "His mind is. Find him. Now." In the shadows of the lower decks, Mason leaned against the wall, catching his breath. The Yelleth were panicking, just as he'd planned. They were strong, but strength meant little without focus. He tapped his comm again, sending a final signal to the devices he'd planted. Across the flagship, systems began to fail. Lights flickered, doors jammed, and the ship's engines sputtered. In the confusion, Mason made his way to the escape pods. He wasn't ready to leave, he had more work to do, but he wanted Skor to believe he was fleeing. Keep them guessing. Keep them chasing shadows. As he slipped into the pod's shadows, he allowed himself a small smile. "This isn't a war of strength," he murmured. "It's a war of minds. And we're just getting started." The lights across the Yelleth flagship continued to flicker, casting the corridors in stuttering shadows. Mason crouched behind a maintenance console, his breathing measured, his mind calculating. The chaos he'd seeded was spreading like wildfire, and the panic in the Yelleth crew was palpable. Every hiss and click of their alien language echoed down the halls, laced with urgency. He tapped a small screen on his wrist, checking the progress of his planted devices. A glowing map of the ship displayed pulsing red dots, his work, strategically placed to cripple key systems. So far, everything was going to plan. But the job wasn't finished. Not yet. Footsteps echoed nearby. Mason flattened against the wall, blending into the shadows. 2 Yelleth guards passed, their heavy claws clacking against the metal floor. "Search every level," one barked. "The human cannot escape." Mason waited until their footsteps faded. He slipped from his hiding spot and moved deeper into the ship, his steps silent, his movements fluid. He couldn't afford mistakes. Not here, not now. On the command deck, General Skor loomed over his officers, his mandibles twitching with restrained fury. The holographic display of the ship's systems showed a cascade of failures: engine control, communications, life support. The human sabotage was spreading faster than they could contain it. "How is one creature doing this?" Skor snarled. His claws raked across the console, leaving deep grooves in the metal. "Find him. We've locked down the engineering bay and sealed off the lower decks," one officer reported. "But he's moving too quickly. It's as if he knows the ship's layout." Skor's eyes narrowed. "He does. This was planned?" His voice dropped to a menacing growl. "He's not just a soldier. He's a strategist." Another explosion rocked the ship, cutting off the officer's reply. Skor turned toward the comms officer. "Redirect all power to the internal sensors." I want his location now. Mason slid into the access tunnel leading to the auxiliary power grid. The space was cramped, the air thick with the smell of burning circuits from the chaos he'd unleashed. He pulled himself along the narrow passage, his mind racing through the next steps of his plan. He reached the grid's control panel and got to work. His fingers moved with practiced precision, bypassing the Yelitha's alien systems and adapting them to his needs. The screen flickered, lines of unfamiliar code scrolling past. Mason's eyes narrowed as he worked. "Come on," he muttered under his breath. "Talk to me." Finally, the panel beeped in confirmation. Mason smiled, small but satisfied. He tapped his comm link. "Earth Command, this is Mason. Phase 2 is underway." The voice on the other end was crisp and steady. "Copy that, Mason. What's your status?" "Busy," he said, glancing at the red dots on his wrist display. "But making progress. Their fleet relies too much on centralized control. Cripple the flagship, and the rest will fold like a bad hand of cards." "Understood. Be careful. They're desperate now." "Desperate means sloppy," Mason replied. "I'll take it." Back on the command deck, the chaos was mounting. Systems continued to fail, and the crew was struggling to keep up. Reports poured in, each more dire than the last. "The human has sabotaged the power grid," an officer announced. "We're losing control of the ship." Skor slammed his fist onto the console, his eyes blazing with fury. "Enough of this! Lock down every section he's been in. Seal the hatches. Flood the lower decks with toxic gas if you must." The officers hesitated, their scaled faces betraying unease. "But General, if we do that we risk—" "I don't care about risks," Skor roared. "This ship is the pride of the Yelith Empire. I will not let it be undone by a single human." Mason was halfway through another tunnel when the air changed. His chest tightened as the faint scent of chemicals reached him. His wrist display beeped, a warning flashing across the screen. "Atmospheric toxins detected." "They're gassing me," he muttered. "Of course they are." He activated a small device on his belt, feeding filtered air into his suit. It wouldn't last long, but it would buy him time. He picked up the pace, navigating through the maze-like passages. His mind raced. The Yelith were reacting faster than he'd anticipated. He needed to stay ahead. Mason dropped into a maintenance bay, landing silently on the metal floor. He scanned the room quickly, his eyes catching on a Yelith engineer working frantically at a console. The alien hadn't noticed him yet, too focused on stabilizing the failing systems. Mason approached quietly, his weapon drawn. "Step away from the console," he said, his voice cold and commanding. The engineer froze, his claws hovering over the controls. He turned slowly, his yellow eyes wide with fear. "Don't shoot," he hissed, his voice trembling. I don't want to die." "Good," Mason replied. "Then you're going to help me." The engineer hesitated, glancing at the weapon in Mason's hand. "Help you? You're destroying the ship." "Why would I?" "Because," Mason cut him off. "If this ship goes down, so do you. Help me, and I might let you live." The engineer's mandibles clicked nervously, but he nodded. What do you want?" "Access to the ship's command overrides," Mason said. "You've got 10 seconds. The engineer worked quickly, his claws flying over the console. Mason watched him closely, ready to act at the first sign of betrayal. But the alien seemed genuinely terrified, his focus entirely on completing the task. "There," the engineer said finally. "You have access. Please don't kill me." Mason stepped forward, examining the console. The overrides were active, giving him control over several key systems. He smirked. "Good work." He raised his weapon, and the engineer flinched, but Mason didn't fire. Instead, he activated a stun device, knocking the alien unconscious. "Nothing personal," he muttered, dragging the engineer into a corner. Mason tapped his comm link. "Command, this is Mason. I've secured access to their central systems. Beginning Phase 3. Copy that, the voice replied. Proceed with caution. On the command deck, Score stared at the failing systems, his fury now tempered by a creeping dread. The human was dismantling his ship piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. General, an officer said hesitantly, perhaps we should retreat. Score's mandibles flared. Retreat? From a single human? Never. The officer's gaze dropped, but he said nothing more. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hum of the failing systems. Score clenched his claws. He thinks he's clever. But he'll make a mistake. And when he does, his voice dropped to a menacing growl, I'll crush him myself. Mason moved through the corridors, his steps steady, his mind sharp. He'd set the stage, and now it was time for the final act. The Yelleth had underestimated him, and soon they'd pay the price. He activated the final device on his wrist display, watching as the system map lit up in red. Game over, he murmured, disappearing into the shadows. The flagship's command deck was a tempest of noise and chaos. Consoles sparked as systems failed one after another. Reports from panicked officers flooded General Score's comms, each more frantic than the last. The once proud heart of the Yelleth fleet was unraveling, and the human, just one human, was the architect of its downfall. Seal all remaining access points, Score barked. His voice echoed through the chamber, cutting through the din. Redirect power to defensive systems. I want that human dead! His officers scrambled to comply, but the cracks in their composure were glaring. The unshakable confidence of the Yelleth Empire had been reduced to desperation. Score's mandibles twitched as he paced, his mind racing. How had it come to this? How had a single, insignificant creature dismantled the pride of their fleet? Deep in the bowels of the ship, Mason moved with calculated precision. The emergency lighting cast long shadows across the corridor as he crept forward, his weapon at the ready. The flagship groaned around him, its systems buckling under the strain of his sabotage. His comm link crackled to life. Mason, this is command. Status update? On schedule, Mason replied, his voice calm despite the tension in the air. Their systems are fried. Power grids failing, comms are down, and they've got no idea where I am. I'm heading for the core now. Good. The Yelleth fleet is still holding position, but they're disorganized. Whatever you're doing, it's working. It's not enough yet, Mason said. This flagship is their nerve center. I'm about to cut the head off the snake. Understood. Stay sharp. The comm went silent, and Mason pressed on. The corridor ahead opened into the reactor chamber, its massive energy core pulsing with a faint blue light. The hum of the machinery was deafening, but Mason had no time to marvel at the engineering. He had a job to do. On the command deck, an officer turned to Score, his claws trembling. General, we've located him. He's heading for the reactor. Score's eyes narrowed. He seeks to destroy us from within. Prepare the elite guard. I will handle this myself. The officer hesitated. But, General. Enough! Score roared. Do you think me afraid of this human? He will learn what it means to face a true warrior. Score turned, his heavy footsteps echoing through the chamber as he left. His mind was clear now, his purpose singular. The human had humiliated them, but it would end here. He would see to it personally. Mason crouched behind a console in the reactor chamber, his eyes scanning the room. The core loomed before him, a massive column of energy encased in protective shielding. He studied it carefully, his mind working through the steps needed to destabilize it. He pulled a small device from his belt and activated it, the screen displaying a series of schematics. As he worked, his thoughts briefly wandered. The Yelleth were stronger, faster, and more advanced. By all accounts, humanity should have been no match for them. But wars weren't won by brute strength alone. Hope you're watching, Mason muttered under his breath, thinking of Earth. This one's for you. The sound of heavy footsteps snapped him back to the present. He slipped into the shadows, his hand tightening around his weapon. The massive doors at the far end of the chamber slid open, and Skor entered, flanked by 2 towering guards. "Come out, human!" Skor's voice boomed, echoing off the walls. "You've proven clever, but cleverness only delays the inevitable. Face me!" Mason stayed silent, his eyes narrowing as he observed the scene. The guards fanned out, their weapons scanning the room. Skor stood in the center, his posture imposing, his mandibles clicking in anticipation. "You think you can destroy us?" Skor continued, his voice filled with contempt. "You are nothing! A speck of dust against the might of the Yelloth Empire!" Mason took a deep breath, steadying himself. He needed to draw Skor away from the reactor. The last thing he wanted was to risk damaging the core prematurely. With calculated precision, he fired a single shot, striking a metal pipe on the far side of the room. The loud clang echoed, drawing the guards' attention. "There!" one of the guards hissed, moving toward the sound. Mason moved swiftly, slipping behind another console. He fired again, this time hitting a control panel. Sparks flew, and the guards turned in his direction. "Coward!" Skor roared, his eyes scanning the room. "Come and face me!" Mason smirked to himself. "You want me? Fine." He stepped out of the shadows, his weapon aimed squarely at Skor. "Let's do this." The guards lunged toward him, but Mason was faster. 2 precise shots dropped them before they could get close. Skor's mandibles flared in anger, and he charged, his massive frame barreling toward Mason like a freight train. Mason dove to the side, narrowly avoiding Skor's claws. The general slammed into a console, tearing it apart with brute force. Mason rolled to his feet, firing as he moved, but Skor's thick carapace deflected the shots. "You're outmatched, human!" Skor bellowed, swiping at Mason with his claws. "Surrender, and I might grant you a quick death." Mason ducked under the swing, his mind racing. He couldn't take Skor head on. He needed to outmaneuver him. His eyes darted to the reactor core, an idea forming in his mind. "You talk too much," Mason said, backing toward the core. He fired another shot, this time striking a panel near the core's base. A shower of sparks erupted, and Skor hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "What are you doing?" Skor growled, advancing cautiously. "Leveling the playing field," Mason replied, his tone cold. He activated a command on his wrist display, and the devices he'd planted throughout the ship came online. The reactor's hum grew louder, its light intensifying. Skor's eyes widened in realization. "You fool! You'll destroy us all!" "That's the idea," Mason said, his voice calm. "You wanted to face humanity's best. Well, here I am." Skor lunged again, but Mason was ready. He sidestepped the charge, slamming a device onto Skor's back as he passed. The device activated with a sharp crack, sending an electric surge through the general's body. Skor roared in pain, collapsing to his knees. Mason didn't hesitate. He sprinted to the reactor controls, his fingers flying over the alien interface. Warning alarms blared as the core's energy output spiked. Skor struggled to his feet, his body trembling from the electric shock. "You'll die with us," he snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "Maybe," Mason said, his eyes locked on the controls. "But at least I'll take you down with me." With one final command, Mason activated the reactor's overload sequence. The chambers shook violently, the core glowing brighter with each passing second. Mason turned, his gaze meeting Skor's. "Game over." He bolted for the emergency hatch, the sound of Skor's enraged roar echoing behind him. The hatch sealed just as the reactor detonated, a blinding light consuming the chamber. Moments later, Mason's escape pod shot away from the crippled flagship, the explosion rippling through space behind him. He watched as the massive ship fractured, its once mighty form reduced to debris. "Mission accomplished," Mason muttered, slumping back in his seat. He activated his comm link. "Earth Command, this is Mason. The flagship is down." "Repeat, the flagship is down." "Copy that, Mason," the voice replied. "You've done humanity proud." Mason closed his eyes, exhaustion washing over him. The Yelleth had underestimated humanity, and they'd paid the price. This wasn't just a victory for Earth. It was a message. Humanity wasn't afraid. And they never would be.